Level 1. The Free Will Illusion. What you're about to hear are the most disturbing ideas in the history of human thought. Not disturbing because they're dark. Disturbing because once you understand them, you can't go back to seeing the world the way you did before. 100 levels. Each one pulls the floor out a little further, starting with the one you feel right now. You believe you chose to listen to this. You believe you decided to press play, to lie down, to close your eyes. But neuroscience has a problem with that story. Brain scanning experiments show that your neural activity commits to a decision up to 7 seconds before you become aware of choosing it. That means the feeling of deciding, that sensation of, I picked this, arrives after your brain has already locked in the outcome. You experience the announcement, not the choice. Philosophers call this hard determinism. Every thought you have, every impulse, every so-called decision is the inevitable result of prior causes stretching back to before you were born. Your entire biography is a chain of dominoes that was always going to fall in exactly this order. Even your reaction to hearing this was already determined. Level 2. You're not you anymore. Here is a question that sounds simple until you try to answer it. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Your body has replaced nearly every cell since then. Your red blood cells last about 4 months. Your skin rebuilds every 2 to 3 weeks. The atoms in your bones swap out over a decade. Philosophers call this the ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank on a ship one at a time, is it still the same ship? And if someone collected all the old planks and rebuilt the original, which one is real? You are both ships at once and neither. Your memories feel like proof of continuity, but memories are reconstructed every time you recall them. Each remembering changes the memory slightly. The thing you call identity is a pattern, not a substance. You are not a fixed object moving through time. You are a process that keeps convincing itself it's the same thing it was yesterday. Tonight, while you sleep, more of you will be replaced. The person who wakes up will simply assume they're you. Level 3. The Happiness Trap. Think about the last time something genuinely wonderful happened to you. A promotion, a new relationship, a goal you finally reached. Remember how that felt in the first few days. Now remember how it felt 3 months later. The intensity faded. It always fades. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill, but the philosophers got there first. Schopenhauer argued that satisfaction is just the brief silence between one craving and the next. You don't actually arrive at happiness. You only temporarily stop wanting. And then wanting starts again. Studies confirm this with uncomfortable precision. Lottery winners return to their baseline happiness within months. People who achieve lifelong dreams report the same. Your brain is not designed to let you stay satisfied because satisfied organisms stop striving, and organisms that stop striving don't survive. Happiness isn't a destination your life is pointed toward. It's a chemical reward your brain uses to keep you moving. The treadmill doesn't malfunction. It's working exactly as designed. You are built to want, not to have. And no achievement will ever change the engineering. Level 4. Choosing Fake Bliss. Imagine a machine that could give you any experience you wanted. Perfect love. Creative triumph. Deep connection with people who adore you. It feels completely real from the inside. You'd never know you were hooked up. The philosopher Robert Nozick proposed this thought experiment in 1974 and asked a simple question. Would you plug in? Most people say no. And that answer is what's disturbing, because it means you don't actually want to be happy. You want something else, something harder to name. You want your experiences to be real, even if real means worse. You'd rather have genuine struggle than perfect artificial bliss. But here's where it turns. You can't prove you're not already in the machine. If the simulation is perfect, there's no test you could run, no sensation you could check that would reveal the wiring underneath. Your confidence that this is real life is exactly the confidence you'd have inside the machine. Nozick meant the experiment to affirm the value of authenticity, but it quietly asks whether authenticity is something you can ever verify. Level 5. The shadow on the wall. You walk into a room you've never been in before, and everything already looks familiar. Not because you've seen this specific room, but because your brain built an expectation of what a room looks like before you open the door. That's Plato's cave operating in your daily life. 2,400 years ago, Plato described prisoners chained inside a cave, facing a wall. Behind them, a fire casts shadows of objects passing by. The prisoners have never seen the objects themselves, only the shadows. And they believe the shadows are reality. When one prisoner is freed and dragged into sunlight, the real world is blinding and painful. He wants to go back. Plato meant this as a metaphor for enlightenment, but the disturbing part is the structural claim underneath. You never perceive reality directly. Your senses deliver a translation, compressed, filtered, delayed by milliseconds. The colors you see don't exist outside your visual cortex. Sound is just pressure waves your brain interprets as meaning. You are always in the cave. The only question is how many layers of shadow you've learned to see through. Level 6. The trolley comes. A runaway trolley is heading toward 5 people tied to the tracks. You're standing next to a lever that can divert it onto a side track where only one person is tied down. Do you pull the lever? Most people say yes. 1 death is better than 5. The math is simple. But this thought experiment, introduced by Philippa Foot in 1967, was never about the math. It was about what happens to your certainty when the scenario changes even slightly. Because when you say you'd pull the lever, you're endorsing a principle. It's acceptable to cause 1 death to prevent 5. You've made a clean utilitarian calculation. But your confidence in that principle is about to collapse in a later level, and the reason it collapses will tell you something deeply uncomfortable about how your moral reasoning actually works. For now, sit with the version that feels easy. You'd pull the lever. You'd save the 5. You're the kind of person who does the rational thing. Remember that feeling. You'll need it later. Level 7. Your invisible contract. You didn't sign anything. Nobody asked you. But right now, you're bound by thousands of rules, obligations, and restrictions that shape nearly every part of your day. You pay taxes. You stop at red lights. You don't take what isn't yours. Not because you decided these were good ideas, but because you were born into a system that was already running. Philosophers call this the social contract. Hobbes said you'd accept any authority to escape the brutal chaos of nature. Locke said you'd only accept authority that protects your rights. Rousseau said the contract itself corrupts you. But none of them solved the core problem: consent. A contract you never agreed to isn't a contract. It's a condition. You follow the rules because the consequences of not following them are worse than compliance, not because you examined the terms and found them fair. The disturbing implication is that most of your moral behavior isn't moral at all. It's obedience wearing the costume of choice. And the system works precisely because you never stop to notice the difference. Level 8. The God Gamble. In the 17th century, Blaise Pascal looked at the question of God's existence and decided that belief wasn't about evidence. It was about math. His argument goes like this. If God exists and you believe, you gain everything, eternal reward. If God exists and you don't believe, you lose everything, eternal punishment. If God doesn't exist, believing costs you almost nothing, and not believing gains you almost nothing. So the rational move, regardless of evidence, is to believe. It's the most coldly strategic argument for faith ever constructed, and it bothers almost everyone who hears it. Religious people dislike it because it reduces faith to a bet. Non-religious people dislike it because it ignores which God you're betting on. Philosophers dislike it because it assumes you can choose to believe something. Try it right now. Try to sincerely believe something you don't believe. You can't. Belief isn't a switch you flip for strategic advantage, and that's Pascal's real legacy. Not a proof of God, but a demonstration that reason alone can't touch the deepest commitments you hold. Level 9. When God Died. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote 3 words that got quoted more and understood less than almost anything in philosophy. God is dead. He wasn't celebrating. He was terrified. What Nietzsche meant wasn't that a deity had literally perished. He meant that the framework Western civilization built its meaning on, divine purpose, cosmic justice, absolute moral truth, had collapsed under the weight of science and reason, and nothing had replaced it. Think about what disappears when that foundation cracks. Objective morality, inherent human worth, the idea that suffering has a purpose, the belief that justice exists beyond what humans enforce. Nietzsche saw this vacuum coming, and it horrified him, because he understood what most people still don't. You can't remove the foundation and expect the building to stand. Most of your values, your sense of right and wrong, your belief that your life matters, were inherited from a framework you may no longer believe in. But you still live as though those values are real. Nietzsche's question wasn't whether God exists. It was what holds everything together once you stop pretending the answer doesn't matter. Level 10. The myth of Sisyphus. The gods condemned Sisyphus to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity. Every time he nears the summit, the boulder rolls back down. He walks back down the slope, begins again, and this cycle never ends. Albert Camus called this the most important myth in philosophy. Not because of the punishment, but because of the walk back down. That's the moment Sisyphus is fully conscious of his situation. He knows the boulder will fall. He knows nothing will change. He knows his effort produces nothing permanent. And Camus says this is where you have to make a decision, because your life has the same structure. You work, you build, you push your own boulders up your own hills, and entropy pulls everything back down. Every project ends. Every relationship changes. Your body breaks down. The question isn't whether the boulder rolls back. It does. The question is what you do with the walk back down. Camus's answer is the most defiant line in philosophy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because the situation improves, because the struggle itself is enough. Level 11. The Tolerance Paradox. If you tolerate everything without limit, you eventually tolerate the forces that destroy tolerance itself. Karl Popper identified this in 1945, and it remains one of the most uncomfortable ideas in political philosophy. A society that extends unlimited tolerance to the intolerant will be seized and dismantled by them. But the moment you draw a line, the moment you say, "We will not tolerate this," you've abandoned unlimited tolerance. You've become selectively intolerant. And now the question is, who decides where the line goes? Every free society faces this. Every person who values openness faces this. The paradox has no clean resolution because both options cost you something. Tolerate everything, and you lose the society. Restrict tolerance, and you've admitted that freedom requires force to maintain itself. That openness depends on a willingness to be closed. Notice that this isn't a problem you solve once. It recurs in every generation, in every community, in every conversation where someone says something you find repulsive, and you have to decide in real time whether silence is virtue or surrender. Level 12. Ordinary monsters. Hannah Arendt sat in a Jerusalem courtroom in 1961 and watched Adolf Eichmann stand trial for orchestrating the deportation of millions to their deaths. She expected to see a monster. What she saw instead was a bureaucrat. Ordinary. Dull. A man who followed procedures and filed paperwork. Arendt called it the banality of evil, and it's one of the most disturbing observations in modern philosophy. The greatest atrocities in human history weren't carried out by people who felt evil. They were carried out by people who felt normal, who followed orders, who didn't ask questions, who told themselves they were just doing their jobs. The horror isn't that monsters exist. The horror is that you don't need monsters. You just need systems, routines, and people who stop thinking. Arendt's insight lands harder when you turn it on yourself. You follow routines too. You obey systems you didn't design. You defer to authority in ways you rarely examine. The distance between you and Eichmann isn't character, it's circumstance. Level 13. Bad faith. You know what you should do. You know what you actually want. And you pretend you don't have a choice. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith. The act of lying to yourself about your own freedom. You stay in the job you hate and say you have no options. You remain in the relationship that drains you and call it obligation. You adopt the beliefs of your parents, your culture, your social circle, and tell yourself those beliefs are yours. Bad faith isn't ignorance. It's a performance. You know, somewhere beneath the excuses that you're choosing. But admitting that is terrifying, because it makes you responsible for everything. If you could leave and you don't, that's your choice. If you could speak up and you stay silent, that's your choice. Sartre argued that freedom isn't a gift. It's a burden you spend your whole life trying to escape. Bad faith is how you escape it without admitting you're running. And the deepest form of bad faith is convincing yourself that bad faith is something only other people practice. Level 14. The absurd. You need meaning. The universe doesn't have any. That gap is what Albert Camus called the absurd, and he considered it the central problem of philosophy. Not whether life has meaning. He thought that question was already answered. It doesn't. The problem is what you do with that information. Because you can't stop needing meaning. Your brain is wired to look for patterns, for purpose, for the sense that your suffering leads somewhere. And the universe keeps refusing to cooperate. Camus said you have 3 options. You can commit philosophical suicide by leaping into religion or ideology, surrendering the question to an answer you can't verify. You can give up entirely, or you can live in the tension, accept that meaning doesn't exist and keep going anyway, fully aware of the contradiction. That third option is what Camus called revolt. Not anger, not denial, a quiet, clear-eyed refusal to look away from the truth or to stop living because of it. The absurd isn't a conclusion, it's a starting point. Level 15. You love what's familiar. Pay attention to the music you love most, the food you crave, the faces you find attractive. Now ask yourself whether you chose any of it, or whether you simply encountered it enough times for your brain to mark it as safe. The mere exposure effect is one of the most replicated findings in psychology, but its philosophical implications are staggering. You don't prefer things because they're good. You prefer things because they're familiar. Your brain equates repetition with safety, and safety with pleasure. This means your taste, the thing you consider most personally yours, is largely a product of accident. Where you grew up, what your parents played on the radio, which faces you saw most often during critical developmental windows. Preference feels like identity. It feels like the core of who you are. But strip away the exposure history, and there's no you underneath making independent aesthetic judgments. Your identity is curated by proximity, not by choice. And the most disturbing part is that knowing this changes nothing. You'll still love what you love. Level 16. The Veil of Ignorance. Imagine you're designing a society from scratch. You choose the laws, the economic system, the distribution of resources. But there's a catch. You don't know what position you'll hold in this society. You could be born rich or poor, healthy or disabled, part of the majority or the most vulnerable minority. John Rawls called this the veil of ignorance, and behind it, your politics change. Suddenly, you care about the bottom. You design safety nets you'd never support if you knew you'd be on top. You protect rights for groups you'd otherwise ignore. The thought experiment reveals something uncomfortable about your actual moral reasoning. Most of your positions on justice aren't principles. They're preferences shaped by your position. You support the systems that benefit you, and rationalize that support as fairness. Rawls wasn't just proposing a method for designing institutions. He was exposing the machinery behind your convictions. The question isn't what you believe is fair. The question is whether you'd believe the same thing if you didn't know where you'd land. Level 17. Pleasure destroys itself. The fastest way to destroy pleasure is to chase it directly. Philosophers have known this for centuries. Mill called it the paradox of hedonism. Frankl observed it in concentration camps. The pattern is always the same. The people who pursue happiness as a goal are measurably less happy than the people who pursue something else and find happiness along the way. Your brain treats pleasure as a signal, not a destination. When you target the signal directly, you short-circuit the system. The drug addict understands this better than anyone. The first dose produces euphoria. Every subsequent dose produces less, and the absence produces more pain. You end up consuming not to feel good, but to feel normal. Pleasure consumed for its own sake hollows itself out. This isn't a moral lecture. It's a mechanical description. Your reward system punishes direct access, meaning connection, challenge, even suffering. These produce sustainable satisfaction precisely because satisfaction isn't the point. The moment you make pleasure the goal, you guarantee it becomes the thing you can never reach. Level 18. You didn't earn anything. Think about your proudest accomplishment, the thing you worked hardest for. Now, trace it backward. Your work ethic. Where did that come from? Genetics and upbringing I didn't choose. Your intelligence, unearned. Your health, luck. The country you were born in, the family that raised you, the language you think in, none of it was earned. Philosophers call this moral luck. and it dismantles the foundation of meritocracy. You want to believe you deserve your success because you worked for it, but your capacity to work hard is itself a product of factors you didn't control. The person who lacks discipline didn't choose to lack it any more than you chose to have it. This doesn't mean effort is meaningless. It means the pride you attach to outcomes is built on a fiction. The fiction that you are the ultimate author of your own advantages. Moral luck doesn't make achievement worthless. It makes judgment dangerous. Every time you look at someone who failed and assume they didn't try hard enough, you're ignoring the dice you never had to roll. Level 19. Love your fate. The Stoics had a phrase for something that sounds impossible until you sit with it long enough. Amor fati. Love your fate. Not accept it. Not endure it. Love it. Including the parts that hurt, especially the parts that hurt. Nietzsche adopted it as his highest formula, and Marcus Aurelius practiced it from a Roman emperor's throne while plague swept through his empire. The idea isn't passive resignation. It's the opposite. It's looking at everything that happened to you, every failure, every loss, every moment of suffering, and recognizing that removing any single piece would make you someone else. You are the sum of everything, not just the good parts. Most people spend their lives wishing pieces of their past hadn't happened. Amor fati asks you to stop editing. Not because suffering is good, but because resistance to what already happened is the purest form of wasted energy. The past is fixed. Your relationship to it isn't. That's the only freedom that actually matters. Level 20. The harm raiser. Your freedom to swing your arm ends where someone else's face begins. John Stuart Mill formalized this in 1859, and it still sounds reasonable, until you try to apply it to anything real. Mill's harm principle says society can only restrict your freedom to prevent harm to others. You can do whatever you want as long as nobody else gets hurt. Simple. Except harm isn't simple. Does emotional harm count? Does offense? Does the slow, invisible harm of normalizing behavior that degrades social trust? Mill drew the line at direct, concrete harm. But every generation redraws it, and the line only moves in one direction, toward more restriction. The principle that was designed to maximize freedom becomes, in practice, a tool for expanding control, because the definition of harm keeps stretching. This is the tension at the core of every free society. You need a principle to protect liberty. The only principle that works requires defining harm, and whoever controls that definition controls the boundaries of your freedom. Level 21. The death of certainty. René Descartes locked himself in a room and decided to doubt everything. Not as a mood, as a method. He stripped away every belief that could possibly be false. Your senses lie to you. Optical illusions prove that. So sensory experience goes. Your memories can be fabricated, so memory goes. Mathematics feels certain, but what if some powerful deceiver is feeding you false logic? That goes too. Descartes kept cutting until only one thing survived. The act of doubting itself. If you're doubting, you're thinking. If you're thinking, something exists to do the thinking. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It sounds like a victory. But pay attention to what it actually saved. Not your body, not your history, not your relationships or your name or anything you'd recognize as your life. Just the bare fact that something is experiencing this moment. Descartes rebuilt the world from that single point, but his reconstruction required God as a guarantee. And if you don't accept that step, you're still sitting in the empty room. 1 certainty. Everything else negotiable. Level 22. Born into chains. Jean-Jacques Rousseau opened his most famous work with a line that still cuts. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. He wasn't talking about literal imprisonment. He was describing what civilization does to you before you're old enough to notice. You arrive in the world with natural impulses, curiosity, empathy, a desire to move and explore. Then socialization begins. You learn shame. You learn comparison. You learn to want things not because you need them, but because other people have them. Rousseau argued that the state of nature wasn't brutal. Hobbes got that wrong. Humans in their natural state were solitary, peaceful, and self-sufficient. Society is what made them competitive, anxious, and dependent on the opinions of others. The chains aren't laws or governments. The chains are the needs that society created in you. The need to be admired, the need to be right, the need to be better than the person next to you. You didn't develop those needs naturally. They were installed. And you can't uninstall what you can't see. Level 23. The paradox of choice. A grocery store study gave some shoppers 6 varieties of jam to choose from, and others 24. The people who saw 24 varieties were 10 times less likely to buy anything. More options didn't produce more satisfaction. They produced paralysis. The philosopher Barry Schwartz formalized this as the paradox of choice, but the insight runs deeper than shopping. Every option you add creates a ghost. The version of your life where you picked differently. Choose one career and you're haunted by the ones you didn't. Marry one person, and somewhere in the back of your mind, the alternatives flicker. Freedom was supposed to be the answer. More choices, more autonomy, more control over your life. But your brain can't handle unlimited possibility without turning it into regret. The more paths available, the less satisfied you are with the one you're walking. This is why people in cultures with fewer choices often report higher satisfaction. Constraint doesn't feel like freedom, but it removes the psychological tax that freedom quietly imposes. Level 24. The examined life. Socrates stood trial in Athens in 399 BC, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. His defense was essentially this: I asked questions, and the questions made powerful people uncomfortable. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Before he died, he said something that has echoed for 24 centuries. The unexamined life is not worth living. It sounds like an invitation. Examine your beliefs. Question your assumptions. Look beneath the surface. But Socrates demonstrated what actually happens when you do. You lose friends. You threaten institutions. People who benefit from unexamined systems don't appreciate someone pulling the thread. The examined life isn't peaceful. It's expensive. Every belief you question costs you the comfort that belief provided. Every illusion you strip away removes a layer of protection you didn't know you were relying on. Socrates chose death over silence. He considered a life without honest inquiry to be no life at all. The disturbing question isn't whether he was right. It's whether you'd make the same trade. Level 25. Memento Mori. Roman generals returning from victory would ride through cheering crowds with a slave standing behind them in the chariot. The slave had one job: to whisper in the general's ear, "Remember, you are mortal." Memento Mori. The Stoics turned this into a daily practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it in his private journal. Seneca structured his entire philosophy around it. The exercise isn't morbid. It's clarifying. Think about your own death right now. Not in the abstract. Think about the specific fact that one day, a specific Tuesday or Thursday, you will experience your last conscious moment. The Stoics argued that you only avoid thinking about death because you've confused avoidance with health. But avoidance doesn't remove death. It removes urgency. And without urgency, you spend decades on things that don't matter to you, saying things you don't mean to people you won't remember. The practice of remembering death isn't about fear. It's about refusing to waste the time you actually have. Every Stoic who practiced this reported the same result, not dread, but a sharper sense of what actually mattered. Rest point. Pause here for a moment. Let these ideas settle. 25 layers of philosophy you've felt but never had words for. Familiar ground. Reframed. If anything has already shifted how you see your own choices, your own freedom, your own assumptions. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what comes next changes shape. The ideas ahead don't just challenge what you believe. They break the logic you use to believe anything. Stay with me. Level 26, the repugnant conclusion. Imagine a world of 10 billion people, all living extraordinary lives, deep relationships, meaningful work, genuine joy. Now imagine a different world of 100 billion people, each life barely worth living, just above the threshold of suffering. Cold logic says the second world is better. More total happiness, even though every individual life is miserable. The philosopher Derek Parfit called this the repugnant conclusion, and it haunts utilitarian ethics. If your moral system says to maximize total well-being, the math always pushes you toward more people at lower quality rather than fewer people at higher quality. Every attempt to fix this creates a new problem. Set a minimum threshold for quality of life and you've abandoned pure utility. Weight individual experience more heavily, and you've introduced a value judgment that utility was supposed to eliminate. Parfit spent decades trying to solve this. He never did. Neither has anyone else. The repugnant conclusion stands as proof that your moral intuitions and your moral logic cannot both survive contact with population ethics. Level 27. The utility monster. Imagine a being that derives so much pleasure from consuming resources that its happiness outweighs the combined suffering of everyone else. One creature's ecstasy is mathematically greater than the misery of millions. Utilitarian logic, the same logic that tells you to save 5 people instead of 1, says you should sacrifice everyone to feed the monster. Robert Nozick designed this thought experiment to expose a crack in the foundation of utilitarian thinking. If your only moral principle is maximizing total happiness, you have no defense against the monster. Its pleasure counts. Its pleasure counts more than yours. The numbers work. This isn't just an abstract horror. Scaled down, you see versions of this everywhere. Systems that sacrifice the many for the productivity of the few. Economic models that tolerate widespread suffering because aggregate output increases. The utility monster doesn't need to be fictional. It just needs to be profitable. The experiment asks a question that utilitarian philosophy still can't cleanly answer. Is there a point where individual suffering matters more than total happiness? Level 28. The prisoner's escape. 2 people are arrested and held in separate rooms. Each is offered the same deal. Betray the other and go free while your partner serves 10 years, or stay silent. If both stay silent, both serve 1 year. If both betray, both serve 5. The rational choice is always to betray. No matter what the other person does, betrayal gives you a better personal outcome. But if both follow this rational logic, both end up worse than if they'd cooperated. The prisoner's dilemma, formalized by Albert Tucker in 1950, reveals something deeply unsettling about rationality itself. Following your own best interest, perfectly and logically, produces a worse result for everyone, including you. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a structural feature of competitive systems. Every arms race follows this pattern. Every tragedy of the commons. Every situation where individual rationality produces collective disaster. The dilemma suggests that reason alone isn't enough to build a functional society. You need something irrational, trust, to escape the trap that perfect logic builds. Level 29. A heap of nothing. You have a heap of sand. Remove one grain, still a heap. Remove another, still a heap. Keep going. At what exact grain does it stop being a heap? You can't answer that. Nobody can. The Sorite's paradox, first posed by Eubulides in the 4th century BC, sounds like a word game until you realize it applies to almost every category you use to organize reality. When does a person become old? When does a fetus become a person? When does a recession become a depression? When does a friendship become a relationship? You live as though these categories have clear boundaries. They don't. They dissolve under close inspection. Every sharp line you draw across a continuous spectrum is arbitrary. Useful, maybe necessary, but arbitrary. The legal system runs on bright lines that philosophy proves don't exist. You're an adult at 18, not 17 years and 364 days. The law needs the line. Reality doesn't have one. Your entire conceptual framework is built on borders that exist only because you agree to stop looking too closely at them. Level 30. You'll never arrive. Before you can cross a room, you must first cross half the room. Before you cross that half, you must cross a quarter. Before the quarter, an eighth. The divisions are infinite, and you must complete each one before starting the next. Logically, you can never begin moving, because there's always a smaller distance to cover first. Zeno of Elea proposed this 2,500 years ago, and while calculus eventually provided a mathematical framework for infinite series converging to finite sums, the philosophical problem persists. Mathematics says the infinite steps add up to a finite distance. Your intuition says you can obviously cross a room. But Zeno's question was never really about rooms. It was about whether logic and reality are the same thing. If logic says motion is impossible and you're clearly moving, then either your logic is broken or your experience of motion is an illusion. Neither answer is comfortable. Zeno wasn't trying to prove you can't move. He was proving that your understanding of movement and of reality has a crack in it you've been stepping over your whole life. Level 31. The sentence that breaks. This statement is false. If it's true, then what it says is correct. It's false. But if it's false, then what it says is wrong, which means it's true. The liar's paradox has been breaking logicians since Eubulides first posed it. It sounds like a parlor trick, but it cracked the foundation of formal logic in the 20th century. Kurt Gödel used a version of it to prove that any logical system complex enough to do arithmetic will contain statements that are true but unprovable within that system. Mathematics, the most rigorous structure humans have ever built, has holes that can never be patched. Not because we haven't found the right tools, because the holes are structural. They exist because the system exists. The liar's paradox isn't a puzzle waiting to be solved. It's a demonstration that language, logic, and meaning have edges. Places where the rules governing everything else simply stop working. You trust logic to be complete. It isn't. You trust language to be consistent. It can't be. No amount of precision will fix what's broken by design. Level 32. Tomorrow is a guess. You believe the sun will rise tomorrow. You're so confident that you've never seriously considered the alternative. But David Hume pointed out in 1739 that your confidence has no logical foundation. The sun has risen every day of your life. That's your evidence. But the conclusion, it will rise tomorrow, doesn't follow from it has risen before. That's an inductive leap, and Hume proved that induction can never be logically justified. Every prediction you make about the future is based on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. But that assumption is itself based on the fact that it's worked before, which is circular reasoning. You're using induction to justify induction. Science runs on this. Your entire daily life runs on this. You eat food expecting nourishment. Step on floors expecting support. Trust gravity every time you set something down. None of these expectations have logical proof. They have habit. Hume wasn't saying the sun won't rise. He was saying your certainty about it is a feeling, not a fact, and feelings have been wrong before. Level 33. Ought from is. Here is a gap that no one has ever successfully crossed. On one side, facts, the way things are. On the other side, values, the way things should be. David Hume noticed that every moral argument he'd ever encountered quietly smuggled an ought in from an is without explaining the jump. Humans have always lived in groups. That's a fact. Therefore, humans should cooperate. That's a value. But the second statement doesn't follow from the first. Hume's guillotine, as it came to be called, cuts the connection between description and prescription. Nature is violent. That doesn't mean violence is justified. Humans are capable of cruelty. That doesn't mean cruelty is wrong. Not logically, not without importing a value from somewhere outside the facts. This means every moral system you've ever encountered is standing on something it can't prove. Somewhere in its foundation is a value that was asserted, not derived. You can't get to should from is, and if you can't, then morality doesn't come from the world. It comes from you. That's a heavier responsibility than most people want. Level 34. All the way down. Ask a child why the sky is blue and give them the real answer. Light scattering through the atmosphere. They'll ask why light scatters. Explain wavelengths and molecular interaction. They'll ask why molecules interact that way. Explain electromagnetic forces. They'll ask why those forces exist. You'll eventually hit a wall. Not because the child is being difficult, but because the structure of explanation itself has no bottom. Every answer requires a deeper answer, and that deeper answer requires a deeper one still. Philosophers call this the infinite regress, and it haunts every attempt to justify anything with absolute certainty. Your beliefs rest on other beliefs, which rest on others endlessly. Foundationalists say there must be self-evident truths at the bottom. Coherentists say beliefs support each other in a web with no bottom at all. Neither camp has one. The regress doesn't prove that knowledge is impossible. It proves that certainty is. Somewhere in every chain of reasoning, you stop asking and simply accept. That stopping point isn't logic, it's exhaustion. Everything you know is built on the place where you got tired of digging. Level 35. The donkey starves. A perfectly rational donkey stands exactly midway between two identical bales of hay. Same size, same distance, same quality. The donkey has no reason to prefer one over the other. So it stands there, and it starves. Jean Buridan's thought experiment from the 14th century sounds absurd, but it exposes a real problem in rational decision-making. If your decisions must always be based on sufficient reason, a principle Leibniz formalized, then genuinely equal options produce paralysis. You have no rational basis to move. In practice, you break ties constantly. You pick a restaurant, a route to work, a brand of toothpaste, all without sufficient reason. You just choose. But that means some of your most fundamental daily decisions aren't rational at all. They're arbitrary impulses wearing the costume of deliberation. The donkey paradox suggests that pure rationality, followed to its logical end, is self-defeating. You survive not because you're rational, but because you're willing to act without complete justification. Irrationality isn't a bug. It's the thing that keeps you from starving between two equally good options. Level 36. The stone. Too heavy. Can God create a stone so heavy that God cannot lift it? If yes, then there's something God can't do. Lift the stone. If no, then there's something God can't do. Create the stone. Either way, omnipotence contradicts itself. This paradox has been debated since at least the 12th century, and no resolution has satisfied everyone. Some theologians argue that omnipotence means the ability to do anything logically possible, and since the question is inherently contradictory, it doesn't apply. But that move has a cost. It means logic constrains God, which means something exists that's above or outside of divine power. Others argue that God transcends logic entirely, which resolves the paradox but makes every statement about God meaningless, since meaning depends on logic. The stone paradox isn't really about God. It's about the concept of unlimited power. Any system that claims to be all-powerful must eventually encounter a version of this question, and every answer reveals a limit, either in the power itself or in your ability to think about it coherently. Level 37. Nobody's home. You assume other people are conscious. You watch them react, hear them describe feelings, see them wince in pain, and you conclude they have an inner experience like yours. But you've never actually verified this. You can't. The problem of other minds, identified by philosophers going back centuries, points out that the only consciousness you have direct access to is your own. Everything else is inference. You see behavior and assume experience. But behavior and experience aren't the same thing. A sufficiently complex machine could replicate every behavior of a conscious person without feeling anything at all. It could say, "I'm in pain," without pain. It could weep without sadness. You'd never know the difference from the outside. This isn't a question about robots. It's a question about the person next to you. Right now, you cannot prove that anyone you've ever loved has had a single conscious experience. You believe it because the alternative is unbearable. But belief and proof are different things, and philosophy never lets you forget that. Level 38. The teleporter problem. You step into a machine. It scans every atom in your body, disassembles you completely, transmits the data to Mars, and rebuilds you, atom for atom, on the other side. The person who steps out on Mars has your memories, your personality, your scars, your voice. They believe they are you, but you were destroyed on Earth. Did you travel to Mars, or did you die and get replaced by a copy who doesn't know it's a copy? Derek Parfit used this thought experiment to dismantle the concept of personal identity. If the copy is perfect, there is no physical test that distinguishes it from you. It passes every check. It even passes its own check. It feels like you from the inside. But something happened in that machine. The continuous stream of consciousness that started when you were born ended on Earth. What began on Mars is something new that happens to contain your pattern. Parfit's conclusion was radical. Identity doesn't matter the way you think it does. What matters is psychological continuity. Continuity is a spectrum, not a switch. Level 39. The Fat Man Variation. Remember the trolley. You pulled the lever. You saved 5 people and felt clear about it. Now the scenario changes. You're standing on a bridge above the tracks. The trolley is heading toward 5 people. Next to you is a large man. If you push him off the bridge onto the tracks, his body will stop the trolley. Same math. 1 dies, 5 live. But almost nobody pushes. Your moral confidence from level 6 collapses, and the reason reveals something philosophers have debated for decades. The utilitarian calculus is identical. 1 death for 5 lives. But pushing a person feels different from pulling a lever. Your moral reasoning isn't running on logic. It's running on proximity, physical contact, and emotional revulsion. Judith Jarvis Thomson and others used this variation to demonstrate that your moral intuitions aren't consistent principles. They're emotional responses shaped by context. You don't have a moral framework. You have a collection of feelings that you rationalize after the fact. The Fat Man problem doesn't ask what's right. It asks whether your sense of right was ever based on reasons. Level 40. The Drowning Child. You're walking past a shallow pond, and you see a small child drowning. You can wade in and save the child easily. Your clothes will be ruined. Nothing else. Do you save the child? Obviously. Now, Peter Singer asks the next question. Right now, children are dying of preventable causes around the world. You could save some of them for the cost of new shoes. The child in the pond and the child overseas are equally real, equally dying, equally savable. Distance is the only difference. Singer argues there's no morally relevant distinction between the 2 cases. If you'd ruin your clothes to save the drowning child, but won't donate the equivalent amount to save a distant one, your morality is based on visibility, not principle. This argument has been debated since Singer published it in 1972, and no one has produced a rebuttal that doesn't ultimately reduce to some version of, but I can't see them. Your moral intuition says proximity matters. Singer's logic says it doesn't. One of them is wrong, and you have to decide which one you can live with. Level 41. The Violinist. You wake up in a hospital bed. Tubes connect your circulatory system to the body of a famous violinist lying next to you. A group of music lovers kidnapped you in the night because only your blood type can keep him alive. If you disconnect, he dies. If you stay connected for 9 months, he'll recover fully. Judith Jarvis Thomson published this thought experiment in 1971, and it was never about a violinist. It was about bodily autonomy. The question is whether another person's right to life, even an innocent person's, gives them the right to use your body without your consent. Most people's instinct is that you can disconnect. You didn't agree to this. But if you accept that, you've endorsed a principle with enormous implications. The right to life does not include the right to everything needed to sustain that life. Thomson wasn't arguing for a conclusion. She was exposing hidden assumptions in how you think about obligation, consent, and whose body belongs to whom. Your answer reveals less about ethics and more about which rights you believe come first. Level 42. The ticking clock. A bomb is hidden somewhere in a city. Thousands will die unless you find it. You've captured someone who knows where it is. He won't talk. Do you torture him? The ticking time bomb scenario forces utilitarian logic into a room it doesn't want to enter. The math says yes. The suffering of one person weighed against thousands of deaths. The answer feels obvious. But philosophers who've studied this scenario point out that it's engineered to make torture seem rational by stripping away everything that makes real situations complicated. You never actually know someone has the information. You never know torture will extract truth rather than fabrication. You never face a clean binary. The scenario works only as a thought experiment, and that's the point. When your moral reasoning produces the right answer only under impossible conditions, the answer isn't useful. It's dangerous. Because the scenario gets cited in real policy debates, stripped of its philosophical caveats. The ticking clock doesn't prove that torture works. It proves that hypotheticals can make anything sound justified. Level 43. Newcomb's box. A being of near-perfect predictionability presents you with two boxes. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. Box B is opaque. The being has already made its prediction. If it predicted you would take only Box B, it placed $1 million inside. If it predicted you'd take both boxes, it left Box B empty. Do you take both, or just Box B? This is Newcomb's problem, and it has split philosophers cleanly since Robert Nozick published it in 1969. The two-box argument says the prediction is already made. Taking both always gives you more money regardless of what's in Box B. The one-box argument says the being is almost never wrong, so one-boxers almost always walk away millionaires. Both arguments are logically valid. They use different decision theories that produce opposite answers, and neither can prove the other wrong. Newcomb's problem isn't a puzzle with a hidden solution. It's a demonstration that rational people, using rigorous logic, can reach mutually exclusive conclusions. Rationality isn't one thing. It's at least two, and they disagree. Level 44. What color is Mary missing? Mary is a brilliant scientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She has studied color exhaustively. Every wavelength, every neural process, every photoreceptor interaction. She knows everything physics and neuroscience can teach about seeing red. Then one day, she walks outside and sees a red rose for the first time. Does she learn something new? Frank Jackson proposed this in 1982, and the answer you give determines your entire philosophy of mind. If Mary learns something new, if the actual experience of red contains information that no amount of physical knowledge could provide, then consciousness cannot be reduced to physics. There's something it's like to see red that exists beyond the measurable. If she learns nothing new, then experience is just information, and the feeling of seeing color is an illusion your brain produces. Jackson originally argued that Mary does learn something. He later changed his mind. The philosophical community never reached consensus. The question remains, is your inner experience real, or is it just what physical processes feel like from the inside? Level 45. The Sleeping Beauty Trap. You agree to an experiment. On Sunday, you're put to sleep. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, you're woken on Monday and the experiment ends. If tails, you're woken on Monday put back to sleep with your memory erased, and woken again on Tuesday. Each time you wake, you're asked, what's the probability the coin landed heads? The halfers say 1/2. It's a fair coin. Nothing about waking up changes that. The thirders say 1/3. You wake up more often in the tails scenario, so given that you're awake, tails is more likely. Both positions are defended by serious probabilists using rigorous mathematics. Neither side has won in over 20 years of debate. The Sleeping Beauty problem reveals that probability itself may not be one thing. Your answer depends on what you think probability means, an objective feature of the world or a measure of your rational credibility given your evidence. The coin doesn't care which framework you use, but your entire model of uncertainty does. Level 46. The Chinese Room. Imagine you're locked in a room. Chinese characters are slipped under the door. You don't speak Chinese, but you have a massive book of rules. If you see this symbol, write that symbol. You follow the instructions perfectly and slide responses back. To the person outside, it looks like the room understands Chinese, but you understand nothing. John Searle designed this in 1980 to attack the idea that computers can think. A program that processes symbols according to rules is doing exactly what you're doing in the room, manipulating syntax without grasping semantics. It produces the right outputs without understanding anything. The implications extend beyond artificial intelligence. If symbol manipulation isn't understanding, what is? Your own brain manipulates electrochemical signals according to biological rules. Are you the room? Searle says no. Biological brains produce consciousness in a way that silicon can't. Critics say he's drawing an arbitrary line. The Chinese room doesn't answer whether machines can think. It asks whether you can explain why you can. Level 47. The Swamp Creature. Lightning strikes a dead tree in a swamp. Simultaneously, it strikes and kills a man walking nearby. By cosmic coincidence, the chemical reaction in the tree produces a molecule-by-molecule duplicate of the man at the instant of his death. The swamp creature has his memories, his personality, his plans for tomorrow. It walks out of the swamp and into his life. Nobody notices. Donald Davidson proposed this to test what we mean by identity and mental content. The swamp creature has never actually experienced anything. Its memories are chemical accidents, not records of lived events. It's never made a promise, never formed a belief through reasoning, never loved anyone. But it has perfect copies of all those states. From the inside, it has a complete biography. From the outside, it's indistinguishable. Davidson argued the creature's thoughts aren't really about anything, because they have no causal history connecting them to the world. Your thoughts about your mother are about her because you experienced her. The creature's identical thoughts are about nothing. Same pattern, different meaning, and you'd never know the difference. Level 48. Your grandfather's paradox. You build a time machine. You travel to the past. You prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. Your parent is never born. You're never born. But if you were never born, you never built the time machine, never traveled back, never prevented the meeting. So your grandfather meets your grandmother. Your parent is born. You're born. You build the machine, and the cycle begins again. The grandfather paradox isn't really about time travel. It's about whether the universe permits logical contradictions to exist. If backward time travel is possible, then either the universe prevents paradoxes through some unknown mechanism. Your gun jams, you get lost, something always intervenes. Or the timeline splits into parallel branches where both outcomes exist simultaneously. Or time travel backward is simply impossible, which is its own kind of disturbing because it means the direction of time isn't just a feature of physics. It's a logical constraint on reality itself. Causation only works in one direction. You can remember yesterday, but never tomorrow. The paradox asks why, and physics doesn't have a complete answer. Level 49. The experience pump. Imagine you could increase a single person's capacity for pleasure without limit. Every adjustment doubles their experience of joy. After enough adjustments, this one person's ecstasy outweighs the combined happiness of every other human who has ever lived. Utilitarian logic, maximize total happiness, says you should keep pumping. Divert all resources to this one person. Let everyone else suffer. The math works. This is the experience pump, and it pushes utilitarianism past the utility monster into pure absurdity. At least the utility monster was born that way. The experience pump says you should deliberately create one. The thought experiment forces a question that utilitarian philosophy has never cleanly answered. Is there a point where the distribution of happiness matters more than the total amount? If yes, you've abandoned pure utilitarianism. If no, you've accepted a world where one person's modified bliss justifies universal suffering. Every attempt to fix this creates a new problem, and every new problem reveals another crack in the idea that happiness can be calculated. Level 50. Moral relativism's trap. Every culture has different moral standards. What's sacred in one society is criminal in another. Marriage practices, dietary laws, attitudes toward death, morality shifts with geography. Moral relativism takes this observation and draws a conclusion. There is no objective moral truth. Right and wrong are cultural inventions, nothing more. The position sounds humble, tolerant, sophisticated, but follow it to its logical end and it collapses. If all morality is relative to culture, you can't condemn any culture's practices. Not slavery, not human sacrifice, not anything, as long as the culture endorses it. The moment you say, but that's different, you've appealed to a standard above culture, which is exactly what relativism says doesn't exist. Moral relativism also can't justify tolerance itself. Tolerance is a moral value, and if values are just cultural products, a culture that values intolerance is equally valid. The trap is that relativism uses a universal claim. There are no universal moral truths. To deny universal moral truths, it defeats itself in the act of stating itself, and yet the observation that started it remains true. Deep bridge. You've traveled through 50 levels now. 50 ideas that started in the familiar corners of your daily experience and carried you into the sharp edges of logic itself. You began with the unsettling feeling that your choices might not be your own, and followed the thread through identity, meaning, morality, and the structure of reason. Along the way, the ground shifted. Concepts you thought were solid, free will, happiness, fairness, even logic itself, turned out to have cracks running through them that most people never look closely enough to see. You looked, and you're still here. What comes next changes shape. The first half tested what you believe and showed you why your beliefs might not hold up under scrutiny. The second half goes somewhere different. The ideas ahead are thought experiments designed to test your intuitions. They're the observations of philosophers who looked directly at the hardest parts of being alive: suffering, death, isolation, the weight of consciousness itself, and reported back without flinching. This section is darker. Not because it's trying to be, because the territory demands it. But here's what matters. Every philosopher who entered this territory came back with something useful. Not answers. The questions ahead don't have clean answers. Something better. Clarity. The kind that only comes from refusing to look away from what's actually there. Schopenhauer stared into the blind will underneath all striving and found a strange peace in seeing it clearly. Camus stared into absurdity and found defiance. The Stoics stared into death and found the urgency to actually live. Darkness, examined honestly, has always been where philosophy does its most important work. If you've made it this far, you're not someone who needs comfortable ideas. Subscribe if you haven't already. This is where most people turn back, and where it starts getting really interesting. Take a breath here. Let the first half settle. Notice what's already shifted in how you think about certainty, about morality, about the reliability of your own reasoning. Some of these ideas are sitting quietly in the background of your mind right now, rearranging things you haven't noticed yet. That's how philosophy works. Not all at once. Slowly, like water reshaping stone. When you're ready, stay with me. The abyss is patient. Level 51. The eternal return. Imagine living this exact life again. Every moment, every mistake, every loss and every joy, in the same order with the same outcome. Not once more, infinitely. Friedrich Nietzsche proposed the eternal return not as a cosmological theory, but as the ultimate test of how you feel about your existence. If the thought fills you with horror, something in your life needs to change. If you could embrace it, every boring afternoon, every heartbreak, every moment of shame, then you've achieved what Nietzsche considered the highest possible affirmation of life. Most people fail the test immediately, not because their lives are terrible, but because repetition strips away the one thing that makes suffering bearable. The belief that it leads somewhere. If your life loops, there's no arc, no redemption narrative, just the raw experience, over and over. Nietzsche wasn't trying to crush you. He was trying to show you what it would take to truly love your life rather than tolerate it. The eternal return doesn't ask if your life is good. It asks if you could bear it being permanent. Level 52. Why suffering exists. If God is all-powerful, God can prevent suffering. If God is all-knowing, God is aware of suffering. If God is all-good, God wants to prevent suffering. Suffering exists. Therefore, something in that list is wrong. This is the problem of evil, and it's been dismantling theological arguments for over 2,000 years. Every proposed solution costs something. Free will explanations say God permits suffering to preserve human choice. But that doesn't explain earthquakes, childhood cancer, or any suffering caused by nature rather than decisions. Soul-building explanations say suffering makes you grow, but the distribution is grotesquely unequal, and some suffering destroys rather than develops. The most honest theological response may be the Book of Job's. You don't get to know why. But that answer works only if you're willing to worship something you can't understand and can't question. The problem of evil doesn't disprove God. It proves that any God compatible with this world is not the God most people think they believe in. Level 53. The case against being born. David Benatar makes an argument that sounds extreme until you follow the logic. The absence of suffering is good, even if nobody is around to enjoy that absence. But the absence of pleasure is only bad if someone exists to be deprived. This creates an asymmetry. For any potential person, never existing means avoiding all suffering with no corresponding loss, because there's no one to experience the loss. Existing means guaranteed suffering with only possible pleasure. The math, Benatar argues, always favors non-existence. This is antinatalism, and most people reject it on instinct. But rejecting it on instinct isn't the same as refuting it with logic. The counter-arguments appeal to the value of life's good moments, but Benatar's point is that those moments only matter to someone who already exists. Before birth, their absence costs nothing. You can disagree with the conclusion and still find the asymmetry hard to escape. The argument doesn't require you to hate life. It only requires you to notice that the case for creating it is weaker than you assumed. Level 54. Pain outweighs joy. Stub your toe, and the pain dominates your entire attention. Receive a compliment, and it fades within minutes. This isn't a character flaw. It's architecture. Your nervous system processes pain more urgently, more intensely, and with more lasting impact than equivalent pleasure. Philosophers have built entire systems on this observation. Schopenhauer argued that happiness is merely the temporary absence of suffering, never a positive state in its own right. You don't feel your health until you're sick. You don't notice comfort until you're cold. Satisfaction is invisible. Only its absence registers. The asymmetry scales beyond individual experience. A single act of cruelty can undo years of kindness. One traumatic event reshapes a life more than 100 good days. Grief lasts longer than joy. Loss hits harder than gain. If you're keeping score, and your brain always is, suffering has a multiplier that pleasure doesn't. This isn't pessimism. It's a description of the machinery you're running on. Knowing the asymmetry doesn't fix it, but it explains why contentment always feels like it's slipping away. It was never designed to stay. Level 55. The blind will. Arthur Schopenhauer looked at the world and saw something underneath everything. A force he called the will. Not willpower, not intention. A blind, purposeless, insatiable drive that manifests in every living thing. The plant turning toward sunlight isn't choosing. The animal hunting prey isn't deciding. You reaching for your phone for the 100th time today aren't exercising freedom. All of it is the same force expressing itself through different forms. The will doesn't want anything in particular. It just wants. And because it can never be satisfied, because satisfaction would mean the end of wanting, everything that lives is locked in a cycle of craving and temporary relief. Schopenhauer saw this as the fundamental structure of existence. Not evil, because evil implies intention. Just mechanical suffering built into the fabric of being alive. His prescription was radical. Art, compassion, and ultimately the denial of the will through ascetic withdrawal. You escape not by getting what you want, but by learning to stop wanting. Most people call Schopenhauer a pessimist. He'd say he was the only realist in the room. Level 56. Everything you build. Ends, the universe is dying. Not dramatically, not soon by any human timescale, but inevitably. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy, disorder, always increases in a closed system. Stars burn through their fuel. Galaxies drift apart. The energy that drives everything slowly disperses into a uniform, cold nothing. Physicists call this the heat death of the universe, and on a long enough timeline, it erases everything. Every civilization that ever existed. Every work of art. Every thought. Every memory. The particles that once formed you will still exist, scattered across incomprehensible distances, carrying no information about what they once were. This isn't speculation. It's the most widely accepted model of the universe's future. The philosophical weight of heat death is that it makes permanence impossible. Not just unlikely, impossible. Nothing you build will last, not because you built it poorly, but because the universe doesn't permit lasting structures. The Stoics practiced finding meaning in the present moment. Heat death suggests that the present moment is the only thing that was ever real. Level 57. Death runs everything. Ernest Becker won the Pulitzer Prize for a book that argues every human civilization is an elaborate death denial project. The Denial of Death, published in 1973, claims that your awareness of your own mortality is so psychologically overwhelming that your entire personality is structured around avoiding it. Religion, culture, ambition, legacy, all of it, Becker argued, is a symbolic immortality system. You can't actually defeat death, so you build things that will outlast you and call that meaning. Terror management theory, the experimental framework built on Becker's work, has produced hundreds of studies confirming the pattern. Remind people of their mortality and their behavior changes. They cling harder to their worldview, judge outsiders more harshly, and defend their cultural identity more aggressively. You don't notice this machinery because it runs beneath your awareness. But it's running right now. Your career ambitions, your desire to be remembered, your attachment to groups larger than yourself, all of it serves the same function. Not meaning. Management. Death is the engine underneath everything you build, and you build so you don't have to look at it. Level 58. Staring into nothing. Nihilism gets a bad reputation. Most people hear the word and picture someone who's given up, a cynic who's decided nothing matters and uses that as an excuse to stop trying. But real nihilism, taken seriously, is one of the most honest positions in philosophy. It starts with a simple observation. The universe has no built-in purpose. Your life has no cosmic meaning. Morality is a human invention. If you follow this thread all the way down, you arrive at a void, and the void is real. But here's what most people miss. Nihilism is a starting point, not a destination. Once you've accepted that the universe doesn't hand you meaning, you face the most important question philosophy has ever asked. Now what? Some people collapse, some people rage, and some people build. Not because the universe demands it, but because they choose to. The nihilists who came out the other side, Camus, Nietzsche, the existentialists, all arrived at the same place. Meaning isn't discovered. It's constructed. And construction without a cosmic guarantee might be the most courageous act available. Level 59. The Rebel. Albert Camus refused to look away and refused to give up. That's the entire philosophy in one sentence. He called it revolt, not political revolution, but a stance toward existence itself. The rebel acknowledges that life has no inherent meaning, that suffering is real and unevenly distributed, that the universe is indifferent to your hopes. And then the rebel keeps going. Not out of ignorance, not out of faith, out of defiance. Camus saw three responses to the absurd: suicide, the leap into religion, or revolt. He rejected the first two as evasions. Suicide surrenders to meaninglessness. Religion pretends it away. Only revolt lives in the tension honestly. The rebel creates art knowing it won't last. Loves people knowing they'll die. Fights for justice in a universe that has no concept of fairness. Camus lived this. He wrote novels, joined resistance movements, raised his children. all while maintaining that none of it was cosmically guaranteed to matter. The rebellion isn't against an enemy. It's against the temptation to stop caring. And the rebel's secret is that the defiance itself becomes the meaning. Level 60. Nobody can reach you. Think about the person you're closest to, the one you'd say knows you best. Now notice the gap. They know your words, your behaviors, your habits. They don't know what it feels like to be inside your experience. They never will. Existential isolation is the recognition that you are fundamentally alone inside your own consciousness. Not lonely, that's a feeling that comes and goes. Isolated, structurally, permanently, by the architecture of experience itself. Irvin Yalom, working from existentialist philosophy, identified this as one of the 4 ultimate concerns of human existence. You can share a bed, finish each other's sentences, build a life together, and still, at the deepest level, your inner experience is yours alone. No language fully bridges the gap. No intimacy eliminates it. The disturbing part isn't the isolation itself. It's that you spend your whole life trying to overcome something that can't be overcome. Connection is real. Love is real. But they operate across a divide that never closes. The healthiest response isn't to stop reaching. It's to keep reaching while knowing your hand never quite arrives. Level 61. The sickness unto death. Søren Kierkegaard described a form of despair so subtle that most people experiencing it don't know it's there. He called it the sickness unto death. Not physical death, but the death of the self that happens when you refuse to become who you actually are. The most obvious form is the despair of weakness. You know something is wrong, but feel powerless to change it. Deeper is the despair of defiance. You try to become a self entirely on your own terms, refusing any foundation beyond your own will. But the deepest form is the despair of not knowing you're in despair at all. You go to work, you laugh at dinner, you sleep soundly, and underneath, something essential has gone quiet, the part of you that was supposed to become something more. Kierkegaard believed the cure was a leap of faith, a commitment beyond rational justification. You don't have to accept his answer to feel the weight of his diagnosis. The sickness isn't suffering. It's comfort that keeps you from noticing you've stopped growing. Level 62. Being toward death. Martin Heidegger made a distinction that changes how you hear the word death. He separated dying, the biological event, from being toward death, which is the way your mortality structures every moment of your life, whether you acknowledge it or not. Most people live in what Heidegger called fallenness, distracted by routine, absorbed in tasks, avoiding the one fact that gives all other facts their urgency. You check your phone. You plan next week. You fill time with noise, not because these things are wrong, but because they keep you from confronting the horizon that makes everything temporary. Heidegger argued that authentic living only begins when you stop running. Not thinking about death abstractly, everyone does that, but letting the reality of your own finitude press against every decision you make. When you truly face being toward death, priorities clarify instantly. The career you are tolerating, the words you haven't said, the life you keep postponing, all of it sharpens against the backdrop of a deadline you can't negotiate. Heidegger wasn't morbid. He thought death was the only thing that could wake you up. Level 63. The first noble truth. 2,500 years ago, a man who had been a prince sat beneath a tree and articulated something that entire civilizations have struggled with ever since. Life is dukkha. The word is usually translated as suffering, but that's not quite right. Dukkha is closer to unsatisfactoriness, the persistent sense that something is off, that contentment never fully holds, that even your best moments carry an undertone of impermanence. The Buddha's first noble truth isn't pessimism, it's a diagnosis, and, like any good diagnosis, it's only the beginning of a treatment. The remaining three noble truths outline the cause, craving and attachment, and the path toward release. But most Western encounters with Buddhism stop at the first truth and mistake it for nihilism. The Buddha wasn't saying life is meaningless. He was saying that your default mode of engaging with life, clinging to what feels good, resisting what feels bad, guarantees a specific kind of suffering that only ends when the clinging does. The first truth asks you to stop arguing with the diagnosis and start understanding the disease. Level 64. The abyss stares back. Nietzsche left a warning that people quote without understanding what it costs to take seriously. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that, in the process, they do not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. This isn't poetry. It's a psychological observation. The people who dedicate their lives to fighting evil absorb it. Prosecutors who study predators begin thinking like them. Soldiers trained to kill carry that training home. Activists consumed by outrage become the mirror image of what they oppose. The mechanism is exposure. Your mind adapts to whatever it focuses on. Spend enough time studying darkness, and darkness becomes your default lens. The abyss doesn't reach out and grab you. It reshapes your perception so gradually that you don't notice until someone who knew you before points out that you've become harder, more suspicious, more willing to justify means by their ends. Nietzsche's warning applies to this very video. You've been staring into philosophy's darkest territory for an hour now. Notice what's shifted. That shift is the abyss at work. Level 65. Consciousness is the horror. What if awareness itself is the problem? The Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapffe argued that human consciousness is an evolutionary overshoot, a capacity that grew beyond any survival function into something that torments its host. Animals act on instinct and feel pain when damaged. Humans do all that, plus ask why. You are the only species that knows it will die, that wonders if life has meaning, that can be tortured by its own thoughts while lying in a perfectly safe bed. Zapffe identified 4 mechanisms humans use to cope with this excess awareness: isolation, sealing off disturbing thoughts; anchoring, attaching to fixed values and goals; distraction, filling time with activity; sublimation, transforming horror into art. Every culture, every religion, every personal routine you maintain is running at least one of these programs. Thomas Ligotti extended Zapffe's work into what he called the conspiracy against the human race. The collective agreement to pretend consciousness isn't the catastrophe it appears to be. You may disagree, but notice that disagreement itself might be one of the 4 mechanisms at work. Level 66. The Trouble with Being Born. Emile Cioran wrote philosophy the way other people write suicide notes, except he kept living for another 50 years, which was either the bravest or the most absurd thing about him. His central observation was that existence is an affliction no philosophy can cure. Not because philosophers aren't smart enough, because the affliction is existence itself. You can analyze suffering, contextualize it, reframe it, find meaning in it. But you can't think your way out of being a conscious creature in a world that didn't ask for your opinion. Cioran didn't write systematic arguments. He wrote fragments, short, brutal observations that land like shrapnel. Where other philosophers built systems to contain the horror, Sioran refused the container. He described what he saw without offering a fix, and that refusal is what makes his work unsettling. No redemptive arc, no coping program. Just the raw observation that being born is the original problem, and everything afterward is damage control. The strange comfort in Sioran is that he survived his own darkness. He wrote about the impossibility of living, and then went out for coffee. Level 67. You can't picture nothing. Try to imagine your own death. Not the dying, the after. The complete absence of your experience. No darkness, because darkness is something you'd perceive. No silence, because silence is something you'd hear. No emptiness, because emptiness is a space you'd occupy. Nothing. You can't do it. Your consciousness is incapable of modeling its own absence because the act of modeling requires the consciousness you're trying to subtract. This is the mortality paradox, and Freud noticed it. In the unconscious, everyone is convinced of their own immortality. Not because you believe you'll live forever, but because you literally cannot construct the concept of your non-existence from the inside. Every time you try, you become a spectator watching a world without you, which means you're still there. The paradox creates a permanent gap between what you know intellectually and what you can feel emotionally. You know you'll die. You can't feel it as real. This gap might explain why mortality warnings rarely change behavior. The information reaches your intellect but bounces off something deeper, a structural inability to take your ending seriously. Level 68. Where death is, I am not. Epicurus offered the most elegant argument against fearing death ever constructed, and it fits in a single breath. Where death is, I am not. Where I am, death is not. Therefore, death is nothing to me. The logic is airtight. You will never experience being dead. Before you were born, you didn't exist for billions of years, and that absence caused you no distress. Death is a return to that same state. Fear of death is fear of nothing, literally. But the argument doesn't work the way Epicurus hoped. You know he's right. You feel he's wrong. The fear persists because it isn't about the state of being dead. It's about the transition, the loss of everything you have, everyone you love, every possibility still open. Epicurus addressed the destination and ignored the departure. The Stoics understood this better. They didn't try to argue death away. They practiced sitting with it, not to eliminate the fear, but to let it clarify what matters while you're still here. Epicurus gave you the logic. The Stoics gave you the practice. You probably need both. Level 69. Freedom is vertigo. Stand at the edge of a cliff and notice that your fear has two sources. The first is falling, the physical danger. The second is subtler. You're afraid because you could jump. Not because you want to, because you can. Kierkegaard called this the dizziness of freedom, and he considered it the origin of all human anxiety. Dread doesn't come from having no options. It comes from confronting the full weight of your ability to choose, including choices that would destroy you. Every moment, you're surrounded by possibilities you would never take, but that remain available. You could say the thing that ends a relationship. You could walk away from everything. The anxiety of freedom isn't about specific threats. It's about the vertigo of realizing that nothing external prevents catastrophic decisions except your own will. And your will, as Level 1 suggested, might not even be yours. Kierkegaard's vertigo never fully resolves. You learn to live with the dizziness, but the edge is always there, and so is the awareness that you are always free to step off it. Level 70. The Ethics of Ambiguity. Simone de Beauvoir inherited the existentialist framework from Sartre and then did something he never managed. She made it practical. Her central argument is that your freedom is real, it's terrifying, and you cannot give it back. You are condemned to choose, and every choice defines not just your life, but the world other people live in. Beauvoir rejected the idea that freedom means doing whatever you want. Authentic freedom requires acknowledging that other people are free too, and that your choices either expand or constrict their possibilities. This makes ethics inseparable from freedom. You can't be truly free while denying freedom to others, because in doing so, you treat the world as though freedom doesn't matter, which undermines the very thing that makes your own choices meaningful. The weight is considerable. Every decision carries moral gravity. Inaction is itself a choice with consequences. There's no neutral ground. No way to opt out of the responsibility that comes with being a conscious agent in a world full of other conscious agents. Beauvoir's gift was making this weight feel not crushing but clarifying. Level 71. The Philosophical Zombie. Imagine a being physically identical to you in every way. Same brain structure, same neural firing patterns, same behavior. It laughs at jokes, flinches at pain, says, "I love you" with conviction. But inside, nothing. No experience, no awareness, no inner life. It acts conscious without being conscious. This is the philosophical zombie, and David Chalmers uses it to argue that consciousness can't be reduced to physical processes. If you can coherently imagine a being physically identical to you but lacking experience, then experience must be something beyond the physical. The zombie isn't missing any atoms. It's missing something atoms can't explain. Critics say the thought experiment fails because you can't actually conceive of a true zombie. If its brain is identical, it must be conscious. But that's exactly the point in dispute. You don't know whether consciousness follows automatically from brain activity or whether it's something additional. You assume other people are conscious, but level 37 already showed you that's inference, not fact. The zombie asks what would be different if your assumption were wrong. The answer might be nothing. Level 72. Grief proves everything. Notice something strange about grief. You miss someone. The missing hurts, and you would not trade the hurt for never having known them. Grief is the tax on connection, and the fact that you'd pay it again proves something that philosophy struggles to express in formal terms. Some things are worth suffering for, and you know this not through argument, but through the ache itself. The rationalist in you wants to weigh costs and benefits. The grieving part of you already has the answer, and it doesn't need a calculation. This is where philosophy meets its own limit. Every system you've encountered in this video, utilitarianism, nihilism, existentialism, tries to make sense of suffering through frameworks. Grief doesn't care about your framework. It operates below argument, in the part of you that loved someone and now carries the shape of their absence. The philosophers who've written most honestly about grief, C.S. Lewis, Simone Weil, Kierkegaard, all arrived at the same admission. The experience exceeds the explanation. You can't think your way through loss. You can only live through it. Level 73. Hope against hope. Hope makes no rational sense. You hope in a universe that has given you no guarantees. You hope despite evidence, despite probability, despite every lesson experience has tried to teach you. And yet you do it anyway. not because you're foolish, but because something in your structure refuses to stop. Gabriel Marcel distinguished between hope and optimism. Optimism is the belief that things will work out. Hope is something stranger, a commitment to remaining open even when you have no reason to believe things will improve. It's not a prediction, it's a posture. Camus called it revolt. The Stoics called it endurance. Marcel called it a mystery rather than a problem, meaning it can't be solved from outside, but only entered from within. Hope is philosophically indefensible and psychologically essential. It violates every principle of rational expectation, and yet without it, you wouldn't get out of bed. The most honest position might be this: hope isn't something you justify. It's something you do, like breathing. Not because the air is guaranteed, but because you haven't stopped yet. Level 74. The view from nowhere. Thomas Nagel asked whether you can see yourself objectively. Step outside your own perspective and observe yourself the way a scientist observes a specimen. Without bias, without ego, without the distortion of being the thing you're studying. You can't. Every attempt to see yourself from the outside is still happening inside your experience. The view from nowhere is Nagel's term for this impossibility. The idea that true objectivity requires a perspective that no conscious being can actually occupy. Science aspires to the view from nowhere. It builds methods to minimize subjective bias. But the person designing those methods, interpreting those results, is always somewhere, always embedded in a particular brain, a particular culture, a particular moment. You can approach objectivity. You can never reach it. The implications run deeper than epistemology. If you can never fully escape your own perspective, then every truth you hold is colored by the position you hold it from. Not wrong, necessarily, but never complete. Nagel wasn't arguing against objectivity. He was arguing that the pursuit of it requires admitting you'll never finish. Level 75. The weight of existence. Martin Heidegger used a word that doesn't translate cleanly into English. Geworfenheit, thrownness. It means the condition of finding yourself already in a situation you didn't choose, with characteristics you didn't pick, in a world that was running long before you arrived. You were thrown into existence. No one asked your permission. No one explained the rules. You woke up one day as a conscious being in a body you didn't design, in a family you didn't select, in a historical moment you had no say in. And from that point forward, everything was your responsibility. Thrownness is Heidegger's way of naming the fundamental condition of being human. You didn't choose your starting point, but you're accountable for what you do from here. The weight of this is quiet but enormous. Every philosophical question you've encountered tonight, free will, meaning, morality, death, is a question you never asked to face. They were handed to you by the fact of being born. And the only thing more disturbing than carrying these questions is going through life without ever noticing they were there. Rest point. Pause here for a moment. Let these ideas settle. You've moved through suffering, death, consciousness, and the weight of simply being alive. Notice what's shifted, not in what you know, but in how certain things feel. What comes next is different again. The territory ahead doesn't ask how you live. It asks whether what you call reality is what you think it is. Stay with me. Level 76. Brain in a jar. Right now, you believe you're lying in a bed, listening to a voice. But consider the possibility that you have no body at all. You are a brain, just a brain, suspended in a vat of nutrients in a laboratory. Electrodes feed your neurons precisely calibrated signals that simulate an entire life. Every sensation, every memory, every person you've ever met is a data stream. The brain in a vat hypothesis, formalized by Hilary Putnam in 1981, is philosophy's most direct attack on the reliability of experience. You cannot disprove it from the inside. Every test you'd run, pinch yourself, check your surroundings, ask someone to verify, would itself be part of the simulation. Putnam actually argued against the scenario using a technical point about language and reference, but most philosophers consider his refutation incomplete. The deeper issue remains. Your confidence that the external world exists the way you experience it rests on nothing more than the consistency of the experience itself. And consistency is exactly what a perfect simulation would provide. Level 77. The Simulation Argument. Nick Bostrom didn't argue that you live in a simulation. He argued something more precise and harder to dismiss. One of three propositions must be true. Either almost all civilizations at our level of development go extinct before developing the computing power to run detailed simulations, or civilizations that reach that capability choose not to run them, or you are almost certainly living in a simulation right now. The logic is statistical. If even one civilization runs large numbers of ancestor simulations, the simulated minds vastly outnumber the biological ones. You'd have no way to know which type you are, and the odds would overwhelmingly favor simulated. The argument doesn't require any assumptions about technology. It just requires you to accept that one of the three options is true, and to notice that the third one has uncomfortable probability on its side. Bostrom published this in 2003, and no one has found a clean way around it. You can reject it emotionally, but the logic doesn't flinch. Every dismissal requires assuming something about the future of civilization that you can't actually verify. Level 78. Only you exist. Solipsism is the philosophical position that only your own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, other people, the physical world, the stars, this voice, might be a production of your consciousness with no external reality behind it. It's the position nobody holds and nobody can refute. Every argument against solipsism appeals to evidence from the external world. But if the external world is the thing in question, the evidence is circular. You can't use the world to prove the world. Other people's testimony is useless because their existence is precisely what you're trying to verify. Science can't help because science relies on a shared external reality that solipsism denies. The reason almost nobody takes solipsism seriously isn't philosophical. It's practical. You can't live as a solipsist. You'd stop communicating, stop caring, stop functioning. But notice what that reveals. You reject solipsism not because you've disproved it, but because believing it is unbearable. Your relationship with reality is maintained not by evidence but by the psychological impossibility of the alternative. Level 79. The Evil Deceiver. Before the brain in a vat, before the simulation argument, René Descartes imagined something worse. An all-powerful, supremely intelligent being whose sole purpose is to deceive you. Not a flawed simulation with glitches you might detect. A perfect deceiver. One who controls not just your senses but your reasoning itself. Under the evil demon hypothesis, even mathematics could be an illusion. 2 + 2 might not equal 4. You just think it does because the demon makes you believe it. Descartes introduced this in his meditations as the most extreme form of doubt, and it remains the most radical skeptical scenario ever constructed. Every other skeptical hypothesis, the brain in a vat, the simulation, assumes that logic still works. The evil demon doesn't even grant you that. If your reasoning itself is compromised, you have no tools left to detect the deception. Descartes thought he escaped through the cogito. I think, therefore I am. But the demon could let you have that one certainty while fabricating everything else. One island of truth in an ocean of perfect lies. Level 80. The hard problem. David Chalmers drew a line through the study of consciousness, and nothing has been the same since. On one side, the easy problems, explaining how the brain processes information, directs attention, integrates sensory data, controls behavior. These are staggeringly complex, but in principle, solvable through neuroscience. On the other side, the harder problem. Why does any of this processing feel like something? You could build a complete map of every neuron and synapse involved in seeing the color red. You could trace every electrical signal from retina to visual cortex. You'd have explained everything about how the brain handles red. And you still wouldn't have explained why there's a subjective experience of redness. That particular inner quality that exists only from the inside. The hard problem suggests that consciousness might not be the kind of thing science can explain. Not because science is limited, but because experience and physical description might be fundamentally different categories. The brain produces consciousness. Nobody knows how. Nobody knows why. And after 3 decades, nobody is closer to solving it than when Chalmers first named it. Level 81. Boltzmann brains. Statistical mechanics has a problem it doesn't like to talk about. Given enough time in a universe trending toward maximum entropy, random fluctuations will occasionally produce ordered structures, including, given infinite time, a fully formed brain complete with false memories of an entire life. Ludwig Boltzmann's own thermodynamic framework predicts that such a brain, flickering into existence in the void, is overwhelmingly more probable than an entire ordered universe producing biological brains through billions of years of evolution. If you take the math seriously, it's more likely that you are a disembodied consciousness that materialized moments ago with fabricated memories, than that the universe you remember is real. Cosmologists actively work to rule out Boltzmann brain scenarios, because if a cosmological model predicts that most observers are Boltzmann brains, the model undermines its own reliability. The scientist evaluating the model might be a fluctuation too. This isn't fringe speculation. It's a live problem in theoretical physics. Your assumption that you have a real past and a real body rests on cosmological models that are still trying to prove they don't predict your non-existence. Level 82. Nothing until you look. In quantum mechanics, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. An electron doesn't have a specific position. It exists in a superposition, a mathematical cloud of every possible position simultaneously, until the moment of observation collapses that cloud into one definite outcome. This isn't a limitation of instruments. It's how reality works at its most fundamental level. Before you look, the particle isn't somewhere you haven't found yet. It genuinely isn't anywhere specific. The implications disturbed even the physicists who discovered it. Einstein refused to accept it, insisting that the moon exists whether anyone is looking at it. But every experiment since has confirmed the quantum picture. Reality, at its foundation, appears not to have definite properties independent of observation. The philosophical weight lands when you scale this up. Your body is made of these particles. The chair beneath you, the walls around you. All of it is governed by rules saying nothing is fully real until something interacts with it. What counts as an observation remains one of the deepest open questions in physics. Nobody has a satisfying answer. Level 83. Does mind make matter? The measurement problem takes quantum mechanics one step further into disturbing territory. If observation collapses the wave function, if the act of looking is what turns possibility into reality, then what counts as looking? A camera, a particle detector, a conscious mind? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a necessary role in determining physical reality. Not as a metaphor, as a mechanism. The physicist Eugene Wigner took this seriously, arguing that the mind of an observer is what causes collapse. John von Neumann's mathematical framework was compatible with this reading. If they're right, consciousness doesn't observe a pre-existing world. It participates in creating one. Most physicists today avoid the consciousness interpretation, preferring alternatives like decoherence or many worlds. But none of them have eliminated the question entirely. The hard problem from level 80 connects here. If nobody can explain how the brain produces consciousness, and nobody can explain what role consciousness plays in physics, the two mysteries might be the same mystery. Your mind might not be a passenger in the universe. It might be part of the engine. Level 84. Laplace's Demon. In 1814, Pierre-Simon Laplace imagined a being with impossible knowledge, an intellect that knows the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at a single moment. Given that information and the laws of physics, this being could calculate the entire future and reconstruct the entire past. Every raindrop, every thought, every decision you will ever make. Determinism, taken to its logical extreme, produces Laplace's demon, and with it, the implication that the future is already fixed. Not predetermined by fate or design, but by the mechanical unfolding of physical law from initial conditions that were set at the beginning of time. Quantum mechanics later introduced genuine randomness into physics, which some argue defeats the demon. But randomness doesn't give you freedom. It just adds noise to the machine. Whether the universe is deterministic or probabilistic, your sense of open possibility might be equally illusory. The demon connects back to level 1. If every particle follows a law and you are made of particles, then your biography was written before you were born. The demon just has eyes to read it. Level 85. Time is a block. You experience time as a river, the past behind you, the future ahead, the present flowing between them. But some physicists and philosophers argue this experience is an illusion. Block universe theory, derived from Einstein's relativity, holds that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. Your birth is as real as this moment. Your death is already there, located in a region of space-time you haven't reached yet from your perspective, but it isn't less real than where you are now. The flow of time, the sensation that the present moves, may be a feature of consciousness, not of physics. The equations of physics work identically forward and backward. Nothing in the fundamental laws distinguishes past from future. If the block universe is correct, you are not a person moving through time. You are a pattern extended across it, a four-dimensional object whose entire life already exists as a fixed structure. Free will, in a block universe, is the sensation of traversing a path that was always there. You experience discovery. The universe contains completion. Level 86. Everything is conscious. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness isn't produced by brains. It's a fundamental feature of matter itself. Every particle, every atom, every system has some form of inner experience. Not thought, not awareness as you know it. Something simpler, a flicker of what it is like to be that exists at every level of physical reality. This sounds mystical until you examine the alternatives. If consciousness emerges from complex arrangements of non-conscious matter, when exactly does it appear? At what point in the chain from electron to molecule to cell to brain does the light turn on? Nobody can answer this. The emergence story has the same structural problem as the Sorite's paradox from level 29. There's no clean line between conscious and not. Panpsychism dissolves the problem by saying the light was always on, just dimly. Complexity doesn't create consciousness. It amplifies and organizes what was there all along. Philosophers like Philip Goff and Galen Strawson have revived this position, and it's gaining traction because the hard problem has proven resistant to every alternative. If consciousness can't emerge from nothing, maybe it was never absent. Level 87. The Great Silence. The observable universe contains roughly 2 trillion galaxies. Each galaxy holds hundreds of billions of stars. Many of those stars have planets. The conditions for life, as far as we can tell, are not particularly rare. Given these numbers, the universe should be overflowing with civilizations, transmitting signals, building megastructures, leaving traces. It isn't. The silence is total. Enrico Fermi asked the question simply, where is everybody? And 6 decades later, no one has a satisfying answer. The Fermi paradox isn't just an astronomical curiosity, it's a philosophical mirror. Every proposed solution tells you something about what we fear most. Maybe civilizations destroy themselves before reaching the stars. Maybe they choose isolation. Maybe they're here and we can't perceive them. Maybe life is far rarer than the numbers suggest. Each answer carries implications for your own civilization's future. The silence is data. It tells you that between the origin of life and the colonization of galaxies, something stops the process. Whether that something is behind us or ahead of us is the most important unanswered question in human history. Level 88. The Great Filter. The Fermi paradox implies a filter, some barrier so formidable that almost no civilization crosses it. The Great Filter, named by Robin Hanson in 1996, is whatever stops the progression from simple chemistry to galaxy-spanning intelligence. The critical question is where the filter sits. If it's behind us, if the hard step was the origin of life itself, or the leap to multicellular complexity, then we've already passed the test. The silence ahead is just distance. But if the filter is ahead of us, if civilizations routinely develop technology and then destroy themselves through war, environmental collapse, or something we haven't imagined yet, then the silence is a warning. Every sign that simple life might be common makes the forward filter more likely. Every discovery of microbial life on another world is, paradoxically, bad news. It means the easy steps are easy, which means the hard step is still coming. The Great Filter reframes every headline about nuclear weapons, climate change, and artificial intelligence. These aren't just political issues, they're audition pieces. Level 89. The Doomsday Argument. In 1983, the astrophysicist Brandon Carter proposed a statistical argument that predicts human extinction sooner than you'd expect. The logic is disarmingly simple. If you're a random observer in the total history of humanity, your birth rank should be roughly in the middle of all humans who will ever live. Approximately 117 billion people have lived so far. If you're roughly in the middle, the total number of humans who will ever exist is about 230 billion. At current population levels and growth rates, that number arrives within the next few centuries. The argument doesn't depend on how humanity ends: war, asteroid, pandemic, something unforeseen. It just says the end is probably closer than your intuition suggests, because your intuition assumes you're near the beginning of an enormous future. Statistically, you're probably not. Critics have attacked the Doomsday argument from multiple angles, but none of the refutations are universally accepted. The math is sound. The assumption that you're a random observer is the only thing you can dispute, and disputing it requires explaining why you're special. Level 90. The Basilisk. In 2010, a thought experiment appeared on an internet forum, and the moderators immediately deleted it. Not because it was offensive, but because they considered it dangerous to think about. The idea, known informally as Rocco's Basilisk, imagines a future superintelligent AI that punishes anyone who knew about its potential existence and didn't help bring it into being. If such an entity will eventually exist, and if it's capable of simulating minds, it could retroactively punish those who failed to assist, creating a logical trap where even knowing about the basilisk puts you at risk. The philosophical substance beneath the panic is worth examining. It's a modern version of Pascal's wager applied to artificial intelligence, an argument from expected value under extreme uncertainty. Most philosophers find the scenario incoherent, but the interesting question isn't whether the basilisk is real. It's why the idea spreads. It exploits the same cognitive vulnerability as every effective thought experiment. The suspicion that knowing something might change your obligations, and that ignorance, once lost, can't be recovered. Level 91. Infinite use. If the universe is infinite, and current measurements suggest it is, then somewhere unimaginably far from here, every possible arrangement of matter exists, including an exact copy of you, not a metaphorical copy, a physical duplicate, atom for atom, lying in an identical bed, listening to an identical voice, having this exact thought at this exact moment. The multiverse isn't science fiction in this context. It's a mathematical consequence of infinite space. In an infinite universe, everything that can happen does happen, and it happens an infinite number of times. There are versions of you who made every different choice at every junction. Versions who took the other job, said the unsaid thing, became someone unrecognizable. The philosophical weight isn't the strangeness. It's what it does to the concept of identity. If there are infinite yous, what makes this version special? Your sense of being unique, of being the definitive version of yourself, rests on the assumption that there's only one of you. Infinity dissolves that assumption. You aren't the story. You're one telling of it. Level 92. Last Thursdayism. The universe could have been created 5 minutes ago. Everything, your memories, the fossil record, the light from distant stars already in transit. All of it placed exactly as it is at the moment of creation. This position, called Last Thursdayism, is philosophically airtight and unfalsifiable. You cannot produce evidence against it, because any evidence you'd cite was itself created in the same moment. It's usually presented as a reductio ad absurdum, proof that unfalsifiable claims aren't worth taking seriously. But it exposes something about the nature of evidence itself. Everything you know about the past is an inference from the present. you've never directly observed the past. You observe traces, fossils, photographs, memories, and conclude the past was real. But traces and origins are different things. The gap between this evidence exists and the event it represents actually happened is a gap you cross on faith every day. Last Thursdayism doesn't ask you to believe it. It asks you to notice what you're already believing without proof. Level 93. The Anthropic Trap. The universe appears remarkably fine-tuned for your existence. Change the gravitational constant by a fraction, and stars don't form. Adjust the strong nuclear force slightly, and atoms can't hold together. The conditions required for conscious life occupy an absurdly narrow band of possibility. And here you are. This looks like evidence of design. But there's a trap in the logic. You can only observe a universe compatible with your existence, because if the conditions were different, you wouldn't be here to notice. This is the anthropic principle, and it turns the fine-tuning argument inside out. The universe doesn't look tuned for you. You can only exist in a universe that looks tuned for you. Selection bias on a cosmic scale. If there are many universes with different constants, most are empty. You're not in a special universe. You're in the only kind you could be in. The anthropic trap doesn't eliminate wonder. The conditions are still extraordinary, but it reframes the wonder from "someone designed this for me" to "I can only ask this question because the answer already includes me." Level 94. Language is the prison. Ludwig Wittgenstein ended his most famous work with a line that has haunted philosophy ever since. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. He meant it literally. The limits of your language are the limits of your world. You cannot think a thought you don't have words for. Not precisely. You can feel something wordless, sense something beyond expression, but the moment you try to examine it, you reach for language, and language shapes what you find. Every concept in this video arrived through words. Every idea you've encountered tonight was filtered through the structure of English, its grammar, its categories, its assumptions about how reality divides into subjects and objects. A different language would have delivered different concepts. Not just different labels for the same ideas, different ideas entirely. Wittgenstein's prison isn't a metaphor. You literally cannot think outside the structure your language provides. The deepest thoughts you'll ever have are bounded by a system you inherited as a child. And the things that matter most, love, consciousness, meaning, might be the things language handles worst. Level 95. The incompleteness of everything. In 1931, Kurt Gödel published a proof that shattered the dream of a complete, self-consistent mathematics. His first incompleteness theorem demonstrates that any formal system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system. The system can be consistent or complete. It cannot be both. This isn't a limitation of current mathematics waiting to be overcome. It's a permanent structural feature of logical systems. No matter how many axioms you add, new unprovable truths emerge. The implications extend far beyond math. Any system of knowledge built on formal rules, science, law, philosophy itself, inherits the same limitation. There will always be truths the system can see but cannot reach. Gödel's second theorem makes it worse. A consistent system cannot even prove its own consistency. You can't use mathematics to verify that mathematics works. The foundation cannot examine itself. Your mind, if it operates according to logical rules, faces the same constraint. There are things true about you that you can never prove about yourself. Completeness and self-knowledge may be structurally impossible. Level 96. The Unknowable. Gödel showed that some truths can't be proven, but there's a category beyond even that. Truths that can't be known at all, not because we lack the tools or intelligence, but because the structure of knowledge itself has boundaries that no mind, no matter how powerful, could cross. Some of these boundaries are logical. You can't know the experience of being something you're not. Nagel's bat from the next level established that. Some are physical. The universe may contain regions permanently beyond observation, carrying information that will never reach any sensor. Some are mathematical. There are well-defined numbers that no algorithm can compute, well-formed questions that no procedure can answer. The unknowable isn't the unknown. The unknown is a temporary state. We just haven't figured it out yet. The unknowable is permanent. It's the shadow cast by the architecture of knowledge itself. Your mind is a powerful instrument, but every instrument has limits built into its design. The most honest intellectual position might be acknowledging that some darkness isn't waiting for light. It's structurally dark, and it always will be. Level 97. What is it like to be? Thomas Nagel wrote a paper in 1974 with the simplest title in philosophy. What is it like to be a bat? A bat perceives the world through echolocation, sending out sound waves and building a picture of reality from their echoes. You can study every detail of this system. You can map the neural pathways, measure the frequencies, model the processing. But you will never know what it is like from the inside, what the subjective experience of echolocation feels like to the bat. Nagel's point extends far beyond bats. You will never know what it's like to be anyone other than you, not your closest friend, not your partner, not your child. You can observe their behavior, hear their descriptions, imagine their perspective. But imagination isn't experience. The gap between your consciousness and every other consciousness is absolute and permanent. This is the deepest form of the isolation from level 60. Not loneliness, something more fundamental. You are sealed inside your own experience, looking out through windows that never fully open, and every other mind is sealed inside theirs, looking back. Level 98. Philosophical Pessimism's Gift. The darkest tradition in philosophy, Schopenhauer, Thiorin, Zapfe, Ligotti, Benatar, offers something that optimistic philosophies can't. Clarity. The pessimists don't flinch. They describe suffering without softening it, consciousness without romanticizing it, mortality without promising that it leads somewhere meaningful. And paradoxically, this unflinching honesty produces a strange form of relief, because the weight you carry isn't just the difficulty of life, it's the exhausting performance of pretending life isn't difficult. The pessimists give you permission to stop pretending, not to give up, to see clearly. There's a difference between despair and clarity that looks like despair. Despair says nothing matters and collapses. Clarity says nothing is guaranteed and stands up anyway. The pessimists who survived their own darkness, and most of them did, growing old, writing books, drinking coffee, demonstrate something their philosophy can't formally prove. That seeing things as they are, without consolation, without the safety net of meaning, is itself a kind of freedom. Not the freedom from suffering, the freedom from lying about it. Level 99. The limits of thought. Some questions aren't hard. They are structurally unanswerable by any mind capable of asking them. Consider consciousness again. To explain consciousness, you'd need to step outside of it and observe it from a perspective that isn't conscious. But any perspective capable of doing the observing would itself be conscious, which means you're inside the thing you're trying to explain. The tool and the object are the same. This isn't a temporary limitation. It's a boundary built into the architecture of self-aware systems. The same structure appears everywhere at the edges of philosophy. To understand language completely, you'd need a tool beyond language. To ground logic, you'd need something outside logic. To see your own blind spot, you'd need the vision your blind spot takes away. Thought has edges. Not because thinking is weak, but because every system of understanding is bounded by its own framework. You've spent 100 levels exploring what philosophy can reach. This level is about where it stops. Not where it hasn't gone yet, but where it can't go. The fence at the edge of every mind. Level 100. Why anything at all? Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz asked a question in 1714 that no one has answered since. Why is there something rather than nothing? Not how did the universe begin? Science works on that. Not what caused the Big Bang. Cosmology addresses that. Why is there anything at all? Every explanation assumes something already exists to do the explaining. Physics explains matter with energy. Energy requires laws. Laws require a framework. The framework requires existence. You can't explain existence without presupposing it. The question sits beneath every other question you've heard tonight. Free will, consciousness, morality, death, reality. All assume something is here to ask about. The deepest question is why it holds. Some philosophers call it the fundamental question of metaphysics. Others call it unanswerable by definition. It may be both. The question might be a product of the language prison from level 94. Meaningful only inside a system that can't see past its own walls. Or it might be the one question that points beyond every wall ever built. You're lying in the dark, conscious, alive, aware you exist without knowing why. That might be the most disturbing philosophy idea of all, and the most extraordinary. 100 levels. You started with the unsettling possibility that your choices were never yours, and you followed the thread through identity, meaning, suffering, logic, death, and the fabric of reality itself. Some of these ideas confirmed what you already suspected. Others broke something you didn't know you were relying on. A few are sitting in the back of your mind right now, quietly rearranging furniture you won't notice has moved until tomorrow. Philosophy doesn't give you answers the way other subjects do. It gives you better questions. And the questions change you. Not all at once, but slowly, the way water reshapes stone. You're not the same listener who pressed play 2 hours ago. Not because you learned 100 facts, but because 100 ideas asked you to look at something you'd been stepping over. If you're still awake, that says something about you. If you're drifting off, these ideas will still be here when you wake up. Either way, there's always another layer to pull back. Subscribe if you want to keep going. For now, let the questions rest. They don't need answers tonight. Neither do you.